Hello, I'm Kathleen Newman from Maine Historical Society, and we just finished our screening of the film Lost Boundaries and are about to start our discussion on that film with Lisa Botcham from the University of Maine and Ardis Cameron, Professor Emeritus at the University of Southern Maine. Thank you both so much for being with us tonight. Ardis, would you mind, I know before we started the film you gave like a brief description. Would you mind doing that again for this recording, just describing the film a little bit for us?
Sure. Well, as I said earlier, it was very controversial, and we can talk about that controversy, but it was released in 1949 and people were stunned. The newspapers talked about the ways in which audiences sat in stunned silence over this. And that's one avenue to really unpack when we talk with the audience here about what was so controversial about the film on a lot of levels. And as I said, it was a so-called true story based on Albert Johnson's life as a mixed race doctor who lived in New England as a white person. So he passed, and not even his children knew that they, as well as he, were a part of a heritage of, well, part Black and part Indian. So the film turns on when it's discovered that the parents, Albert Johnson and his wife, are, as they say in the movie, Negro, and that happens because he's recruited really into the Navy, that he's a radiologist, and there are very few radiologists in the country. So they really are looking for radiologists in the Pacific. He volunteers, and then of course it's during that process that they discovered that he was a member of a fraternity, a Black fraternity at the University of Chicago. Chase, I think it's called Rush Medical College. So
this was filmed on location in New England, correct? It takes
yes, in various areas in New England, including Maine. The truth, there's a fiction in the film. The fiction is that he goes to the South and is rejected from a Black hospital because he's white. He can pass for white, and that's a terrible fiction, because in truth, African Americans, light-skinned and dark-skinned, were all over the professions, in the South, and they were regularly welcomed into different hospitals. But actually, in truth, Albert Johnson applied to the Maine General Hospital, the General Hospital of Maine, which is in Portland, Maine. And he applied there for his internship because in Maine, they didn't ask for racial identification. So he actually interned in Portland and then bought the practice in Gorham, actually, for about $1,000, and then moved to Keene, New Hampshire.
So some questions are starting to come in from the audience. So we know part of this film was filmed in New England. Was it shown in Maine and New Hampshire?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It premiered in New York, but then after that, it was distributed all over the country. It was a national distribution. It was banned in Atlanta, Georgia. It was banned in Memphis, Tennessee. It was banned in a number of southern states because of what was called the explosive nature of the film. And we can talk about that too, but it was shown in New Hampshire. It was shown in Maine, yes.
I know our first comment from one of our viewers in the chat, it, in a lot of ways reflects how I was feeling watching this film, which is just, wow, I had no idea that this was a story that I confess I was completely ignorant of before we decided to do this program. And I think, do you find it's a story that shocks a lot of people from New England, or just a lot of people in general?
Well, I can't really speak for the audiences, but going back to what Jim Seymour is saying, the casting was very interesting. It was both very controversial among the African-American critics, like Ralph Allison was very upset. There was a lot of criticism among progressive blacks and black intellectuals. But the casting of Mel Ferrer, it was his first film he's ever been in. He was Cuban. And most of the actors who were passing were white actors. And that was highly criticized among African Americans because it led to the assumption that, among many Americans, that true blacks, if you were really a Negro, you couldn't pass. That passing, was, in this movie, it seemed fake because it was cast by all white people. So it reinscribed that notion that every white person would know if you were black or not by those markers. But on the other hand, many of the actors were amateurs. The minister was actually the minister of de Rochemont's church.
Oh, wow.
And so many of those people were just really called in to perform these roles. They were actually real people in Keene and elsewhere, except obviously Canada Lee, who was the black policeman at the station. Canada Lee was a very famous black actor who, because of the conditions, of acting at the time, was limited to the roles he could play.
Interesting. I know, Lisa, before we started the discussion, you had something you wanted to ask or that you wanted to add?
Well, yeah, no, I was, because I don't know the history of the making of this film. So I'm just wondering, so you were confirming that the cast was, of the black passing characters was completely white. Are there notes about how they made the decisions to cast that way? Or do we know why it was cast in the way it was?
This is part of the controversy because it goes back and forth. De Rochemont argued that he couldn't find black actors that weren't already so stereotyped. And on the other side of that were black actors who said, well, you haven't looked hard enough because the only roles we can get are those stereotypical roles. So black actors were in a terrible bind. On the one hand, if they acted too white, or too stereotypical, they were considered they couldn't do anything they couldn't perform in any other way. So that was a highly controversial move on the part of de Rochemont. And it was, I think, very disappointing that he couldn't look beyond the stereotypes and find black actors who could have actually played those roles very, very well and very brilliantly.
I mean, quite frankly, what I do know about film in that period is that, we find that happens all the time, right?
Yes.
Like, Pinky, right, was played, that was the title role of Pinky, also black passing story. She's played by a white actor, I think.
Yeah, but Imitation of Life is a black actress. Yeah. So
in Imitation of in
1933, yeah.
Oh, in the original one.
Yeah. And the other piece here too is that, in the true story, it ends in this kind of optimistic way in terms of New England accepting this difference, in this sense of tolerance. But in truth, Albert Johnson was crushed, and he removed himself from the Rotary Club and all the clubs in Keene, and then eventually moved to Hawaii. But he felt that in 1949, 1950, things were getting worse for African Americans, not better. And he felt this was a great blow, to this movie, to him.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he was not a fan of the film.
No, he felt it was much too optimistic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Understood.
And then it kind of shut down conversations and discussions about the mythology of the North being so different from the South.
Right.
That racism, and that does come out periodically in the film. You see this talk in in the kitchen, about serving people in the parish house, and
Right.
you do get, and the dropped blood, so you do get the sense.
Mhm.
Also,
I love that. I mean, that scene was so dramatic. It was like,
yeah,
okay, I mean, it was such a huge metaphor. The spilling of the black chauffeur's donated blood.
Mhm.
Oh my
yes, yes.
gosh.
And it went to the heart of the, the idea of blood being somehow colored blood versus white blood,
Right.
Yeah.
and these mythologies that were very prevalent in popular culture.
There is a question from the audience about what motivated the film,
Mm.
which I think is a good question. I mean, it seems as though the film is trying to kind of expose, on some level, expose the racism of New England, and kind of expose that, the myth of exceptionality, that we don't, the whole
Yes,
idea of we're
yes,
not
yes,
racist.
exactly. Yeah, de Rochemont was part of a group of Hollywood connected directors and producers who, after World War II, found a window of opportunity to delve into the plurality of America and really begin to look at different kinds of communities, Jewish families, ordinary citizens. Marty was part of this, group of writers. And many of these writers and producers were blacklisted by 1951, 1952. But this was a window where they were experimenting with different perspectives and trying to unpack racism in America, and a variety of other topics, including immigration and other issues, even homosexuality, and certainly anti-Semitism. The Gentleman's Agreement was,
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of too. Yeah.
But they were shut down by McCarthy, as we move into the 1950s. Home of the Brave was another one. This is considered the second race film of that time period, Home of the Brave being the first one. And Home of the Brave was produced in secret. No one knew what was going to happen. And so they produced this in secret. And when it came out, it was very explosive. And that's why when this film was talked about, MGM pulled out, because MGM was afraid of offending Southern audiences. So it was very, very explosive kinds of material that did try to penetrate these open secrets that seem to have shut down so much, and that were opened up during the World War II. World War II opened up all of these questions and issues. And so these filmmakers were following up on that wave of cultural sensitivity and pluralism.
Although obviously with big limits. Like, I have to say, I laughed out loud when Howard runs away to Harlem to
Yes.
find
Yes.
himself as a black man. I was just like,
well, when we ask ourselves, how are these identities constructed in the popular imagination, you can see how Harlem becomes the opposite of, New England, keen New England. I mean, there's this incredible sense of whiteness being full of tolerance and pluralism and a sort of, indifference to race differences, whereas Harlem is the black life, and that's full of criminality.
Yeah. Shadow, like all that shadow.
Yeah.
There's no daylight in Harlem.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's a complicated film.
Yeah, no. I have to say, it's so fascinating because it does both those things. Like, it does totally trade in stereotypes, and yet it really does work very cogently to break down, that the whole idea of New England not being a racist region, and I have to give it kudos for that. It is very kind of audacious at the time. I mean, even now, quite frankly, we still love to have that myth.
No, it was. I mean, it was shocking to people. As I said, the reviewers spoke about audiences sitting in stunned silence in 1949.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. I can imagine. Yeah, no, and you know, the thing is that, like I was thinking about these actors throughout the film too, and wondering how they were read by audiences at the time. So I understand totally by that there would have been criticism by Black intellectuals and writers and actors for not finding Black actors, and yet I wonder if audiences were stunned in part because of this recognition that, oh, maybe there were Black people in their communities that they didn't know, like just like any kind of passing, you know, of any sort. This like recognition that that was possible. I just wonder if that was. I mean, it's hard to know what audiences think, but I do think it's kind of, again, I would prefer to see Black actors in those roles, and yet I do wonder what work having white actors might have done.
One of our audience members is asking, is there any connection between this film and the Sinclair Lewis book, King's Blood Royal?
I don't know.
I don't know either. Is the question about whether the director was influenced by?
I think it's their similar stories, and that novel came out a couple years, but just a few years before this movie.
Mm-hmm.
So just
No,
like
a
rudimentary Google search tells me the novel is about a white middle-class man who discovers, researching his family background, that he is directly descended from an African adventurer on the American frontier. So
the thing is that U.S. narratives are full of passing stories. I mean, it's an enduring narrative, and as some of our colleagues work on this in a much larger way than I do, but I mean, we see it over and over again. It's not a new story. I don't
you don't know if there's any connection between
any particular connection there. Yeah. So this is by no means, there's just a long history of passing narratives. So I don't know if this one may have
the story told in this film isn't necessarily, even if it's one we may not be familiar with as viewers, it's not necessarily that unique.
Right. It is not a unique story for the US. So there's some questions for that I think only Ardis could answer. So I don't know if you're seeing these, Ardis, but there's a question about if Dr. Johnson actually enlisted in the Navy or tried to, and also did the son have a friendship with the singer, and was the singer's father really a judge? So I guess like that that kind of interracial friendship, if that was also.
Yeah, and what was the first part of that question?
Did Dr. Johnson try and enlist in the Navy?
Yes, he did. Yeah. He did, and that's how he was exposed. That's part of the story is very, very true. And it came out that he had been a member of that fraternity, and that's how they found that out. The son, Albert Johnson Jr., was a jazz musician and had friends with African Americans because of his work. I'm not sure about the father being a judge, if that was true or not, but he definitely had many friends who were African Americans. And after that, he went on to be a musician, composer.
And then there's a question about the human stain. Yes, another passing narrative. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Something we're still interested in. I mean, it's such a fascinating topic because, it does kind of expose the hypocrisy and mutability of race. It also shows, how race is a social construct and, not biological, right? So
not in the blood. Yeah.
not in the blood, right? Exactly. So I think that's one of the reasons why we remain so fascinated with these stories. And then there's a question about what happened to
There's also something about Albert Johnson Jr. too, that in-betweenness, the in-betweenness in the mulatto. I mean, there is that sense of, what's reckoned as white, what's reckoned as black. And at some points in the American South, up until the 1960s, really, you could start in Florida and you could be 30% black. And then by the time you got to Arizona, you were 90% black. All the state laws are very different about what constituted whiteness or what constituted blackness. And in terms of the daughter, I just saw a question about what happened to the daughter. I actually don't know. He had 4 children.
Oh.
Dr. Johnson had 4 children, and I don't really know what happened to the 4 of them. It was Albert Johnson Jr. who really got this story going with Louis de Rochemont. They collaborated.
So, okay, so that was the son.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, question about further presentations regarding historic African American communities in Maine. Well, not from our project here, but I don't know, maybe the Maine Historical Society has some things.
We did do one earlier this fall with Dr. Kate McMahon from the Smithsonian. She did a great presentation on a Black community in Warren, Maine, the Peterborough community. And she did that with this is terrible, I'm forgetting the gentleman's name, but someone who's a descendant of a family from that community. They gave a great presentation that you can see the recording of on our website at mainhistory.org. And we definitely have plans to do more work with Dr. McMahon. She's doing a lot of really interesting work on slavery in Maine and the history of the slave trade in Maine. So we're going to be working on some more projects with her and with some other folks in the coming year. So keep watching.
There's a good book about Blacks in Bangor too.
Yep.
Black Bangor, I think it's called.
Yes.
Maureen. Sorry, I can't remember her last name, but
a former USM professor.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wonder, can you speak a little more to, the shock and the response that this got from a lot of audiences?
Well, again, World War II exploded a lot of myths about a variety of groups, from homosexuals to African Americans, Jewish Americans. It just was untenable after World War II to continue these falsehoods and mythologies about these groups, because they had served in World War II, and it really became too difficult to maintain this narrative. So new narratives were growing. And they came through these films and then eventually television, but also novels at the time, really beginning to explore the diversity of American culture and the American population. So when this film came out, a lot of people were shocked over, one, the reluctance among so many people to accept African American doctors, the issue of the blood spilling, the idea of racial, racial color in blood. That was just the beginning of trying to understand that race was more of a social construction than a biological, inherent characteristic. And then the diversity of Blackness within Black communities, so that hierarchy as well. And then I think the personal the sort of personal reconciliation between trying to fit into a white society and the tensions about that. Brookline, Massachusetts, for example, was an integrated community at the time. And this resistance among African Americans to claim Blackness in the context of racist America. So there's all these different elements, but I think one of the shocks was that it took place in New England, northern New England in particular. So keep in mind that New England is creating, since the 1920s and 30s, this incredible inventive notion about itself as being very, very mythical in terms of its whiteness, its connection to, its connection to America,
Right.
all of
The kind of the origins, the cradle of
the
American
origin
culture.
stories, American culture. And so by this time period, New England really has this image as being extremely conservative and white and without any kind of racial discord. And in fact, in the 1930s, remember, New England is the most ethnically populated region of the country. It has more Catholics than any other region in the country, more ethnic groups than any other region in the country. So at the very moment in the 1930s that you're creating this myth of the conflict-free, white, New England, you have these social forces that are disrupting that. And so in the 1940s, you begin to see films and books disrupting this notion of New England. And of course, it all blows up with Peyton Place in 1956. It really pulls the lid off of that mythology and that sort of notion, bringing in Franco-Americans, bringing in Catholics, and bringing in the sort of open secrets that Lost Boundaries also taps into. The secrets behind those houses, in New England.
Right.
But I mean, the secrets were like on the state level too, because of course there were all of like the eugenicist programs and like, the hiding people of color and other marginalized communities in, institutes for the feeble-minded and all sorts of things like that. Like, I mean, there were like concerted effort in the sundown towns, all of those. There were like, it wasn't like we were not only was northern New England or New England, one would say, ethnically diverse. There were these concerted efforts to make sure that whiteness was, remained dominant and part of a very privileged group.
Well, even in Maine, there's tremendous diversity. We still think of Maine as very white, but remember, whiteness grew whiter and whiter over the years.
Yeah.
The Irish were considered colored until the Franco-Americans came, and then the Franco-Americans were considered colored until new immigrant groups moved in. So you had quite a diversity despite the, mythology that's built over this, and not just in Maine, but of course all northern New England.
Yeah. So there's another question, or did the film cause race regression or fear of who your neighbors really were? Oh, in terms of McCarthyism, was the film so the question is the film directly responsible for any, is that what I'm assuming that's what the question is.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the film comes out in 49 and it does draw attention to ethnic conflict. And it draws attention to this issue of passing, but it also draws attention to the diversity, in this country and the Black people's experiences. So even though there was a controversy on the left in terms of Black actors and other parts of the film really is an assimilationist film. It doesn't call people to revolt, and it doesn't call people to resist segregation per se, because you can assimilate, the argument is. But from McCarthy's point of view, it became fodder for the argument that racial groups and riots and communists and all hosts of anti-Americanism was going on, and these films were targeted as anti-American. Even someone like de Rochemont, who was doing Time Marches On, was vilified by McCarthy later on and blacklisted for a while.
Mm-hmm. So I want to give our audience, if they, one more opportunity, if they have any questions that they'd like to ask, please don't hesitate to share. But before as we kind of wind down the discussion, Lisa or Ardis, do you have, anything that you would just like to close this discussion out on? Any particular points or ideas?
Well, I think it's a curious movie and an interesting film. And I think it'll always generate lots of interesting discussions. I just saw somebody who mentioned, I'm curious about the audience makeup of theater who would have gone to see the movie. So were they somewhat preaching to the choir with these films? But no, they weren't preaching to the choir. Again, this film was seen as incredibly controversial because it showed African Americans as real people. I mean, we forget that so much of African American acting had been stereotyped and made into buffoon and Step and Fetch It and all the cartoons and Gone with the Wind, remember, came out in the late 30s. So this was a very realistic approach to looking at the African American experience and exploring the sensitive, issues. So audiences were very surprised, shocked, and impressed by seeing African Americans like Canada Lee acting in ways that were very defiant of these previous stereotypes. So as much as we can criticize it from our point of view, it was still a very poignant experience.
And in a lot of ways too, it sounds like.
So somebody in the Q&A, somebody asked a really good question about were there Black audiences for this film, and if so, what was the registered response of those?
Well, in New York, it was mixed audiences. In the South, it had been banned in many areas, so it was hard to tap into audience reaction in the South or in mixed audiences that were just African American audiences. It would be hard to kind of get that, but there was not one feeling about it. As I said, there was controversy within the Black community, within the Black press. Some Black press heralded the film, others vilified it because of the reasons we all talked about earlier. So it wasn't just one opinion. There was a lot of controversy going both ways, but it did sparked a reaction. And that's what de Rochemont really wanted, to people sort of discuss these issues, think about these issues, and about race in America, bringing it forward as, something we had to think about more thoroughly.
So should we take this last question?
Sure, we can go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, so the last question is, was it banned in the South because it portrayed Blacks as real people?
That was part of it. And you can also see from, let's say, a Southern segregationist point of view, it's showing society that's not segregated.
Not segregated. Mm-hmm.
It's showing society that Black people can sing, in a parish church. Mm-hmm. It shows Blacks as brilliant doctors. It had these representations that, for segregationists in the South, were flattering to African Americans. And so, no, they did not want to see these representations that were so positive. We might see some of the negatives of that today, but for segregationists, it was not something that they could tolerate in their theaters.
Well, thank you both so much. This was a really informative and really interesting program. I really appreciate you're taking the time to share this with us and to share your expertise. Is there anything else before we close? I don't know, Lisa, is there anything else in this series of programs that you want to promote, or anything else that either of you are working on that you'd like to let people know about?
Well, so as I mentioned at the start, we have still 12 other programs that were supposed to happen pre-COVID. So I don't know their status right now. I don't know. Right now, we're taking a wait and see approach for next year and seeing if we can get some of it done. But so I want to thank you, Kathleen, for suggesting that we go ahead with a virtual program, because I think this is our a great plan B. And thank you so much, Ardis, for not only kind of generating this whole idea, but also for tonight's discussion, which I think is really super terrific. So appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, thanks, Kathleen.
Yeah, thank you both for being so flexible and kind of adjusting to this plan B, and working with Maine Historical Society to figure out how we could still bring folks this program and that we could do it virtually. And thanks everyone who could join us tonight. You were a great audience with thoughtful questions. If you'd like to learn more about Maine Historical's upcoming programs, or how you can visit, become a member, do research at Maine Historical Society, be sure to visit our website, mainehistory.org. And again, just thanks everyone for participating.
Yes, thank you so much. So appreciate.
Our
Thanks
pleasure.
very much.